Picture a boorish older brother so hilariously menacing that even turning him into a giant talking pile of excrement couldn't dull his swagger. That's Chet Donnelly in a nutshell, just one of the many wild details lurking behind the scenes of Weird Science. If you've ever wondered how Bill Paxton came up with that over-the-top performance, or how the filmmakers managed to pull off a transformation so crazy that claustrophobia almost wrecked the entire gag, this video is for you. In celebration of John Hughes's off-the-wall 1985 teen fantasy, we're diving into 20 things you never knew about Weird Science. From Bill Paxton's claustrophobic freakouts to pranks so outrageous they nearly got cast members fired, we've dug up the behind-the-scenes scoop that will make you see this cult classic in a completely new light. Ready to find out what really happened on that set and how a beloved 80s comedy almost spun off the rails? Then let's get started. From the vantage point of today's media landscape, filled with superhero blockbusters, slick teen dramas, and computer-generated spectacles, it can be hard to grasp just how quirky, bold, and boundary-pushing a mid-1980s teen comedy could be. Yet in August 1985, the world got Weird Science, a film that combined adolescent fantasy, broad slapstick humor, practical special effects, cutting-edge, for the time, computer references, and a cast of then rising stars who would go on to shape Hollywood in myriad ways. While most people remember the film for its premise of two teen outcasts creating the perfect woman using a home computer, there is a remarkably deeper story behind the production, one shot through with pranks, near firings, bigger than expected budgets, cast camaraderie, comedic misadventures, leftover ideas from its writer-director's earlier work, and a dash of that 1980s brand of irreverence we rarely see today. In what follows, we'll explore in detail the making of Weird Science, the real-life antics on set, the unforeseen influences that shaped the movie, and the ripple effects it had on the cast and the era's pop culture. Along the way, we'll fill in historical context from the mid-1980s, add personal speculation and new tidbits gleaned from interviews, unearth the occasionally wild sense of humor that defined that generation of comedic filmmaking, and show how Weird Science, despite its comedic nature, helped to mold the career arcs of actors like Robert Downey Jr. and Anthony Michael Hall. In an era when personal computers were just beginning to find their way into suburban homes, the notion of hooking up a weirdly advanced system to a Barbie doll and some random trinkets in the hope of bringing a digital creation to life is both whimsical and telling. Weird Science arrived at a cultural juncture. Personal computing was starting to move from niche interest to mainstream tool, but it still retained a mad scientist aura for many. Teens fiddling with early Apple models or Commodore 64s represented an entire subculture of enthusiastic experimenters. Hollywood capitalized on that mystique of technology in various ways, from more serious fare, like War Games, 1983, to comedic or fantasy takes like Electric Dreams, 1984. In that sense, Weird Science sat squarely in the comedic corner of the tech-influenced film pantheon, pushing the idea that a well-meaning but clueless teen might harness a computer's infinite potential for personal gratification. That concept was both comedic and faintly transgressive, particularly for 1985, when the moral panic over teen sexuality and unsupervised tech soared. The film's writer and director John Hughes was then on a near unbeatable streak of teen-oriented hits. He'd emerged from a background writing for National Lampoon and had penned National Lampoon's Vacation, 1983, which introduced him to comedic film success. He then directed 16 Candles, 1984, and The Breakfast Club, 1985, each a striking reflection of teenage identity. Weird Science completed this trifecta of Hughes-directed teen comedies, though tonally it leaned more toward whimsical fantasy than the heartfelt introspection of The Breakfast Club. According to various sources, Hughes wrote the Weird Science script at a breakneck pace, possibly over a couple of days, a style reminiscent of his approach for earlier works like 16 Candles. One crucial distinction: Weird Science was a departure from the interior drama approach that anchored, say, The Breakfast Club. This time, Hughes indulged a more cartoonish comedic sensibility, reminiscent of his National Lampoon roots. He never pretended the film was intended to offer profound insight. Instead, it's a comedic odyssey with teen boy wish fulfillment at its center. Yet ironically, that comedic tone sometimes overshadowed the incisive social commentary about how teenage boys might struggle with insecurity, peer pressure, and identity. Fans often note that Weird Science took its title from a 1950s EC Comics publication. EC Comics is best remembered for horror anthologies like Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror, but they also published science fiction anthologies, one of which was literally titled Weird Science. The original comic bore no direct relation to the film's storyline about conjuring up a dream companion through technology, though one might argue that the gonzo spirit of EC's imaginative short stories resonates faintly in the film. The reference demonstrates that John Hughes, or the producers, might have wanted an evocative, pulpy title that matched the film's comedic yet weirdly sci-fi premise. The final text and marketing materials used that distinctly stylized Weird Science logo, giving it a slight throwback flair that complemented the 1980s neon vibe. Lisa, the magically created woman at the film's center, was played by the then 24-year-old Kelly LeBrock, who'd already experienced success as a model and had broken out on screen in Gene Wilder's The Woman in Red, 1984. Despite that success, she initially declined the role in Weird Science, being content to stay in the south of France, and, she has mentioned in interviews, spending time with Sting. The filmmakers had in fact cast someone else, model Kelly Emberg, but found her performance unsatisfactory after a few weeks of shooting. Desperate to salvage production, they circled back to LeBrock. Convinced at last, she hopped on a plane to Chicago more or less immediately, stepping into a role that demanded comedic timing, a dash of maternal wisdom, and a flamboyant, playful sensuality. This last-minute switch proved crucial. LeBrock delivered a performance that gave Lisa surprising warmth and comedic bite. Fun fact: the film's comedic approach might cause some to overlook how Lisa's presence questions the typical male fantasy object. She's not just a robot woman fulfilling every wish. She actively encourages Wyatt and Gary to grow up, respect themselves, and push back against bullies. Some viewers see her as a subversion of teen male fantasies. That said, the storyline remained grounded in the comedic premise that two clueless teen boys try to create the perfect woman, an approach thoroughly of its 1980s comedic moment. Anthony Michael Hall was fresh off bigger triumphs with John Hughes, having starred in 16 Candles and The Breakfast Club. Hall's teenage comedic persona, equal parts awkward and witty, endeared him to audiences. Meanwhile, Elon, sometimes spelled Elon, Mitchell Smith was less well known. He'd had a small role in The Wildlife, 1984, and at age 14 or 15 during filming, he was one of the youngest leads in a John Hughes film. On screen, the chemistry between Hall's boisterous, slightly cynical Gary and Mitchell Smith's shy, sweet-natured Wyatt feels organic. Yet behind the scenes, a few comedic scuffles arose. For instance, Mitchell Smith once got too eager during a kissing scene with Kelly LeBrock, evidently slipping in some tongue. The anecdote resonates with the era's casual approach to adult minor scenes. By modern standards, the moment would likely raise eyebrows with producers and audiences alike. Important, even though Hall and Mitchell Smith had comedic synergy, they moved in different career directions afterward. Hall soon parted ways with Hughes and eventually cultivated more adult roles, culminating in films like Johnny Be Good, 1988, Edward Scissorhands, 1990, and eventually a stable career in comedic and dramatic parts. Mitchell Smith, by contrast, drifted away from Hollywood, returning for only a few small roles before pursuing academic life, ultimately achieving a PhD in medieval studies and becoming a professor. Today, fans occasionally see Mitchell Smith pop up at conventions or cameo on nostalgic TV episodes referencing weird science, but he remains primarily an academic. Though not the film's main antagonists, the bullies Ian, Robert Downey Jr., and Max, Robert Russler, serve as comedic foils for Gary and Wyatt. At the time of filming, Downey was merely 19, still crediting himself as Robert Downey, without the junior in some official documentation. He had performed in a few small roles, but weird science preceded his jump to mainstream attention. According to cast recollections, Downey's early comedic persona was flamboyant, mischievous, and full of pranks. He and Russler appear to have built a behind-the-scenes camaraderie that occasionally went too far. Famously, both young men joked about defecating in a female co-star's trailer, a bizarre juvenile gag that suggests the laissez-faire comedic environment of an 80s set. If accounts are accurate, Downey might have actually done it in one trailer, nearly costing him his job. It reveals the off-screen reality that teenage or early 20s actors, thrust into a comedic film, can let boundary-pushing jokes overshadow typical on-set decorum. Hughes reportedly threatened to sack him, yet the film pressed on. For Downey, who would soon land a stint on Saturday Night Live, 1985 to 1986, and keep building comedic, dramatic roles, Weird Science was just another stepping stone. The film arguably consolidated his bad boy comedic image, long before addiction problems and eventual redemption refashioned him into a global star with Iron Man, 2008. Meanwhile, Robert Russler would also become known in the 80s for roles in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, 1985, and Thrashin', 1986, forging a modest career as a teen star. Interesting. According to John Hughes' initial script, Ian and Max were indeed supposed to suffer a more dramatic punishment, being turned into barnyard animals. That concept fell away in rewrites, possibly for time or comedic pacing. Instead, all we see is an extravagant party meltdown with no big karmic comeuppance. In a John Hughes film that brims with comedic set pieces, there may be no character more simultaneously hilarious and fearsome than Bill Paxton's Chet Donnelly, the tyrannical older brother who makes life miserable for Wyatt, Island Mitchell Smith, and, to a lesser extent, Gary, Anthony Michael Hall. Chet bursts onto the screen like an unhinged drill instructor, barking orders about household chores, wielding firearms in the kitchen and demanding tributes of money and food. What makes him so unforgettable is the collision of dead serious bullying tactics. He scolds Wyatt for staying up late, turns on Gary for daring to sleep over, and spouts lines of sarcastic menace with a wild comedic style that only Bill Paxton could deliver. While some 1980s teen comedies emphasize the bully as a mere annoyance, Paxton's Chet functions like a tornado in camouflage fatigues, a pestering, gun-loving lunatic who relishes tormenting his younger brother and flaunting his imagined authority at every turn. Yet the film saves a massive dose of comeuppance for Chet in its final stretch, courtesy of Lisa's supernatural powers. One of Weird Science's most uproarious moments is Lisa deciding that Chet deserves to experience true humiliation. In an almost cartoon-like feat, she converts Chet into a grotesque living mound of talking excrement, a slimy, gurgling, poop-like creature that can barely form words as it begs Wyatt to keep his secret. It is a moment that cements Chet as one of the great comedic bullies of 1980s cinema, because rather than a typical lesson learned or banishment from the house, he literally ends the movie as a quivering pile of sludge. For fans, that transformation scene remains iconic, not just for its outlandishness, but for how effectively it caps Chet's villainy. Here is a man who believed he was untouchable, reduced to a heap of odor and slime that can do little more than grunt and plead. According to various behind-the-scenes anecdotes, filming this transformation presented real technical and psychological hurdles. Originally, the plan was for Bill Paxton himself to be inside the practical effects suit, using carefully orchestrated puppetry from the inside to make his excrement-like body move and squish around. The character would thrash in comedic agony, continuing Paxton's lines and expressions in some animatronic hybrid. But Paxton reportedly faced serious claustrophobia once he tried to climb into the suit. He found himself breaking into panic under the latex and foam. Fears of suffocation or being unable to move made the entire process impossible for him. Rather than rewrite the finale or cut the gag, the production tapped two little people to operate the suit from within, while Paxton recorded dialogue to be dubbed over the footage. This approach, while more logistically complicated, ensured that Paxton didn't have to endure physical torment in order to complete the comedic payoff. The result on screen is that the pile of feces wiggles, grumbles, and flails, but the voice is unmistakably Paxton's. He improvised lines about being sorry, and I was just kidding. That highlight how thoroughly Chet's bravado has dissolved. For Bill Paxton, Chet marked an important waypoint in a career that was only just revving up. Although he had appeared in minor roles previously, such as a punk in The Terminator, 1984, he was hardly a household name. Weird Science gave him a platform to display an over-the-top comedic vein, revealing that beneath the everyman face was a fearless clown who could shout lines like, "How about a nice greasy pork sandwich served in a dirty ashtray?" without missing a beat. Soon after, Paxton's career took a sharp turn into higher-profile science fiction and action films. James Cameron had already spotted Paxton's charisma, casting him in Aliens, 1986, as Private Hudson, a role that showcased a comedic hyperventilation, game over man, that became instantly memorable. From there, Paxton marched through a string of 80s and 90s hits: Near Dark, 1987, Predator 2, 1990, Tombstone, 1993, Apollo 13, 1995, and Twister, 1996, balancing comedic flair with earnest dramatic chops. In some ways, the outre comedic mania he displayed as Chet foreshadowed how easily he could pivot between comedic dialogue and action-oriented tension in those later projects. For audiences looking back, it's fascinating to note that while the older brother bully remains a staple in teen movies, rarely do they become so unhinged and irreverent. Chet steals scenes because he is so far beyond just being a jerk. He's the guy who will gleefully point a shotgun at Wyatt's friend or demand hush money for simply occupying a bedroom in the family home. Through it all, Paxton exudes a bizarre charm, as if he knows that the entire premise is delightfully silly and is pushing it to the edge. The choice to give him that final humiliation, being turned into a talking turd, has become one of John Hughes's most shock value gags, revealing how Weird Science was more willing than some of Hughes's other teen films to embrace broad cartoonish set pieces. Interestingly, there was talk on set about whether the excrement transformation might go too far. Some behind-the-scenes reflections suggest that test audiences howled at the unexpected nature of it, leading the filmmakers to double down on the comedic approach. Bill Paxton's looming claustrophobia, ironically, only made the final effect more outrageous, since it's truly an animatronic job, freeing Paxton to focus on comedic voice work that accentuates Chet's deflated ego. Later interviews with Paxton show that he looked back on the role fondly, amused that fans would spot him and quote lines like, "How about a nice greasy pork sandwich?" at conventions or signings, decades after the film's release. Ultimately, Chet Donnelly stands as a microcosm of what Weird Science does best. It takes archetypal teen movie tropes, the nasty older brother, the jock bully, the repressed nerd, and escalates them to insane comedic extremes. Chet is not a subtle menace, but a comedic wrecking ball who roars onto the screen with such boisterous negativity that viewers can't help but find him both despicable and hysterically funny. The film lets him roam unchallenged for most of its runtime before punishing him in a manner that no other teen comedy had quite attempted before, concluding in a flourish of surreal creativity. In subsequent interviews, co-stars joked that no one else could have done to Chet what Bill Paxton did. It speaks to Paxton's unique comedic energy and willingness to contort himself, sometimes literally, into a caricature of alpha male bullying. For fans of 1980s cinema and John Hughes completists, that cameo-ish but scene-stealing performance by Paxton is an essential ingredient. Without Chet, the film wouldn't have that sense of real threat, that tension for Wyatt in his own household, or that triumphant payoff when Lisa intervenes and flips the script. His presence also set a kind of standard for comedic bullies in later teen or fantasy-tinged comedies. Thus, even if Bill Paxton eventually became famous for more mainstream action and drama, his turn as Chet remains an enduring gem for those who crave that perfect synergy of mania, comedic timing, and quasi-horror transformation. The behind-the-scenes drama, claustrophobia, mechanical suits, last-minute voice dubbing only deepens the appreciation for how improbable it was that this comedic bit worked at all. That it did work so spectacularly highlights both Paxton's talents and John Hughes's knack for orchestrating comedic madness in a decidedly off-the-wall 80s teen fantasy. Weird Science, with its $7.5 million budget, had fewer resources than many big studio blockbusters of the day. Yet it attempted ambitious set pieces, including a rocket blasting through the house, bizarre storms that swirl indoors, and furniture that whips about in a comedic tornado. This was an era pre-CGI, meaning the production relied on practical rigging, elaborate sets, and creative illusions. For instance, the rocket was physically constructed to pierce through the house in comedic fashion. Setting it up and resetting for multiple takes was time-consuming and by 1985 standards, pricey. One anecdote says that when Anthony Michael Hall unexpectedly farted during a key take, the entire cast and crew collapsed into laughter, forcing them to reset everything, costing an additional $100,000. If that figure is accurate, it underscores how high-stakes comedic scenes could be, with every second of filming carefully orchestrated. Furthermore, we know that the team behind Weird Science built specific contraptions for comedic illusions, a vacuum effect that drags party guests up the chimney, or the swirling data storm that leads to the creation of Lisa. Mythical though it seemed, That swirl of random images, including bras, pictures, circuit boards, magazine cutouts, was physically staged using fans, wires, and manual editing. Compare that to modern visual effects, and it might look quaint or 80s cheap, but for the time, it demanded a surprising chunk of the budget. While Weird Science is overshadowed by other 80s comedies that flaunted more explicit teen lust, like Porky's or Revenge of the Nerds, it still teases certain illusions of nudity. The iconic shower scene with Lisa, for instance, became a hallmark of the film's marketing. Some VHS covers featured an illustration implying an intimate moment. Yet, as later revealed, Kelly LeBrock was not fully nude during filming. She wore bikini bottoms and taped her nipples, ensuring no real impropriety. The teenage characters also remained clothed. That comedic approach, though it might have suggested innuendo, never advanced into explicit territory. Interestingly, as some cast members have admitted, the real nudity is fleeting at best, ironically coming from the cameo actress Kim Malin, the piano girl, or a blink and you miss it moment in the final sequences. Malin, a Playboy centerfold from October 1982, gets swept up the chimney in the film's chaotic finale. The comedic chaos overshadowed any real attempt to sexualize her cameo. By 1980 standards, Weird Science was fairly mild, focusing more on comedic fantasy than raw sexual material. That's part of why it garnered a PG-13 rating. Fairly novel in 1985, the year after the MPAA introduced PG-13. The rating gave the film broader accessibility to the teenage crowd at which it was aimed. Because Weird Science came from an era of big, bold teen comedies, Back to the Future, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, etc., it might have remained a quirky footnote if not for the syndicated longevity it found on cable TV and home video. The premise was so alluring that in 1994, producers launched a TV spin-off series of the same name, running until 1998. Starring Vanessa Angel as Lisa, Michael Menasseri as Wyatt, and John Asher as Gary, the show mirrored the original story. Two adolescent geeks conjure a magical computer-generated woman who can solve problems or conjure zany scenarios. While the show never equaled the film's iconic status, it lasted 5 seasons, quite a robust run for a comedic fantasy series in the 1990s. The series toned down some of the racier 80s irreverence, leaning on more family-friendly comedic adventures. One overlooked synergy. The 90s TV show arrived when syndicated comedic series with slight sci-fi or fantasy twists, like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, were popular. Viewers who didn't grow up with the 1985 film might have discovered the brand for the first time on TV. A new generation of fans, in turn, sought out the original film to see how it all started, thereby reinforcing Weird Science as a staple in the VHS and DVD markets. One curious aspect is how this film effectively ended the creative partnership between John Hughes and Anthony Michael Hall. Prior to Weird Science, the synergy of actor and director seemed unstoppable. Hall was basically the Hughes muse, cast as the comedic or brainy teen in multiple hits. Indeed, Weird Science positioned Hall as the top-billed star, overshadowing even Kelly LeBrock's credit. But something happened behind the scenes, some personal or creative conflict that led Hughes and Hall to part ways. They never collaborated again. By 1986, John Hughes wrote and directed Ferris Bueller's Day Off with Matthew Broderick, and Hall pursued more adult comedic roles, Johnny Be Good, 1988, or edgy dramatic fare, like 1990's Edward Scissorhands, where he played a jock bully. Speculation about their rift abounds. Some guess that the tension might have come from Hall's increasing sense of comedic improvisation, or rebelliousness on set. Others wonder if it was a personal falling out not specific to the production. Neither side ever gave a definitive explanation, but the outcome was that Weird Science became the last direct Hughes-Hall team-up, marking the end of an era for 80s teen comedies. Anthony Michael Hall soon turned down a cameo in National Lampoon's European Vacation, ironically continuing the tradition that the Griswold kids always changed actors. Later that same year, he joined Saturday Night Live, becoming the youngest cast member in SNL history at 17. That season, 1985 to 1986, is widely regarded as unsuccessful, leading to his departure. He overcame some missteps, forging a durable career in both comedic and dramatic roles, culminating decades later in an array of cameo appearances, supporting roles, and even a starring role in the Stephen King-based TV series The Dead Zone, 2002 to 2007. Eileen Mitchell-Smith, as mentioned, parted ways with acting to pursue an academic track. He occasionally reemerges at conventions or in cameo references about 80s teen flicks. But the wide gulf between Wyatt from Weird Science and Dr. Eileen Mitchell-Smith, medieval studies professor, is one of the more surprising transformations in 80s teen star history. Robert Downey Jr., post-Weird Science, was soon known for being part of the short-lived 1985 to 1986 SNL cast alongside Hall. The show's poor ratings in that era impacted both their comedic prospects on TV. Yet Downey pivoted to significant roles in films like Less Than Zero, 1987, eventually earning an Academy Award nomination for Chaplin, 1992, struggling with personal issues and later re-emerging triumphantly as Tony Stark in Marvel's Iron Man, 2008, forging one of the biggest star arcs Hollywood has ever seen. Robert Rusler continued acting in 80s teen or horror films like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, 90s TV series, and remains a recognizable face to fans of that decade's pop culture. Kelly LeBrock, while the film revitalized her star power, later stepped away from mainstream Hollywood after roles like Hard to Kill, 1990. She eventually returned sporadically, often focusing on personal or family life, sporadic cameo appearances, or reality TV stints. Despite that, Lisa remains her most iconic part in comedic film circles. Bill Paxton, over the next few decades, rose to mainstream stardom, delivering memorable parts in James Cameron's Aliens 1986, True Lies 1994, and Titanic 1997, plus main roles in films like Twister 1996 and the TV series Big Love 2006-2011. For fans of 80s comedic farce, though, Chet might always be his funniest role. John Hughes directed only 8 films total, pivoting in later years to writing and producing under pseudonyms, focusing on family comedies like Home Alone, 1990. Weird Science was in some ways a turning point. His later directorial efforts, Ferris Bueller's Day Off Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Uncle Buck, included fewer teen elements and more adult comedic or heartfelt angles. Though overshadowed by bigger John Hughes hits like The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Weird Science stands out for its flamboyant comedic energy, the infusion of 80s home computer fascination, and a brash approach to adolescent fantasy. Over time, it's become a cult favorite. Film critics often place it in the second tier of Hughes's teen oeuvre, praising its comedic set pieces and the offbeat synergy of the cast, while noting it's somewhat more dated than the more timeless, heartfelt teen films from the same era. Cultural references abound. Songs, shows, or other comedic bits often label any comedic attempt to build a dream partner or magical solution as pulling a Weird Science. The Oingo Boingo theme song, Weird Science, remains iconic. That synth-driven track underscored the movie's credits, capturing the hyper, neon-laced vibe of mid-'80s comedic escapism. Given that Oingo Boingo was fronted by Danny Elfman, who would later become one of Hollywood's most in-demand composers, that theme song also forms part of Elfman's broader legacy. The film occasionally crops up in discussions about how 80s teen comedies handled female characters. Some see Lisa as objectifying women. She's literally a fantasy being shaped by two horny teenage boys. Others see it as more progressive than it appears. Since Lisa exerts free will, orchestrates the boy's personal growth, and doesn't become a docile love slave, she remains in control, punishing bullies and guiding Wyatt and Gary toward self-confidence. John Hughes might have inserted comedic subversiveness into what, on the surface, looks like a pure teenage male daydream. As for the rating of comedic risk, Weird Science mostly retains a breezy comedic tone. Yet the shower scene or Lisa's wardrobe might have stoked minor controversy. In many foreign markets, the film's posters or local titles emphasize the comedic fantasy woman angle. For instance, in Denmark it was titled Rør ved mig, Jeg er din, Touch Me, I'm Yours, playing up the sexy comedic concept. Marketing in Japan gave it a contrasting name, Electric Venus, again referencing the same theme of a goddess conjured from technology. A lesser-known piece of synergy is that, months after filming concluded, co-stars Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Downey Jr. found themselves cast members on Saturday Night Live for the 1985 to 1986 season. This came about as producer Lorne Michaels was revamping the show with a younger cast. Some watchers hoped that Hall and Downey's comedic synergy from Weird Science would cross over into SNL skits. However, the season turned out to be fraught. Critics slammed the show's direction. Many cast members were fired or replaced. Hall, at 17, was widely recognized as a comedic talent, but still inexperienced in live sketch performance, and Downey's brand of humor didn't mesh well with the format. They parted ways with SNL after one season, marking a comedic footnote in their respective careers. Given that Weird Science had opened in August 1985, that means the SNL fiasco began in the fall of that same year, effectively overshadowing any short-term comedic successes gleaned from the film's popularity. Some watchers recall seeing them together in skits, only to remark how drastically different the comedic vibe was from John Hughes's carefully scripted and orchestrated style. If Weird Science showed them as two bullies who amused themselves with pranks ironically, they ended up in a comedic environment where pranks or on-set joking might not have been well received. One detail often cited is that Lisa, the name of the perfect woman, references Apple's Lisa model. Indeed, Apple's Lisa, named after Steve Jobs' daughter, or so the story goes, predated the Macintosh, offering an advanced GUI. The Weird Science script hints at an Apple Lisa concept, a forward-thinking piece of technology that might well conjure wonders if you typed in the right code. Yet ironically, the actual computer used on screen is a Memotech MTX 512, a short-lived British computer from the early 1980s. The brand never reached wide commercial success and folded after a short time. That might be a comedic irony. The film references a piece of consumer tech that flopped, reflecting how ephemeral the home computer market was in the mid-'80s. While audiences see Wyatt and Gary hacking away with elaborate code and hooking up wires to a Barbie doll, the reality is that the Memotech on set was mostly a prop, with any hacking sequences constructed in post-production. However, for fans of retro computing, the Cameo is a neat time capsule. The Memotech, featuring a sleek black metal case, stood out visually among the more common Commodore or Apple machines that the film gave it a cameo inadvertently immortalizes a brand that soon disappeared. Viewed decades later, some comedic bits in Weird Science would likely be retooled if the film were made today. As noted, the scene in which 14-year-old Wyatt kisses 24-year-old Lisa might have raised red flags with censors or child protection advocates. Similarly, some jokes about bullies defecating in female co-stars' trailers, or Bill Paxton's open gun obsession as comedic material might not fit contemporary sensibilities. The Boys in Bras promotional images, featuring Hall and Mitchell Smith wearing bras on their heads while hooking up wires, testify to an 80s comedic brand that was at once silly, carefree, and borderline transgressive. One might reflect, John Hughes's comedic style for teen fantasies in the 1980s was often anchored in more overt subversions or shocking visuals than his intimate teen dramas. Weird Science stands as something of a cousin to the teen sex comedies like Porky's, though more sanitized and less explicitly sexual. The film's a PG-13 rating let it straddle a line of raunchy but not X-rated humor. The film's central comedic set piece is a house party gone haywire. Jazz musicians appear, random punks roll in, antique furnishings spin in an indoor tornado, a nuclear missile rockets out of the floor, random guests float away, and comedic guests like the aforementioned Kim Malin get whisked up a chimney. Filming that chaotic centerpiece required extensive, carefully synchronized gags. The set had to revolve or shake, wind machines had to blow objects around, and many extras had to coordinate comedic reactions. This scene was a major sinkhole for the budget, as effects had to be done practically. No CGI to fix errors in post. The number of retakes soared whenever an actor cracked up or a prop launched incorrectly. In modern times, a single digital effect might cost a fraction of what these practical effects cost. But in 1985, blowing a hole in the set for the rocket or hooking up harnesses for multiple airborne stunts meant pulling in specialized rigging teams, building scale models for certain shots, and using elaborate forced perspective. Because comedic timing is everything, each mishap forced a reset, which escalated time and costs. Tales from the cast indicate that such reshoots were frequent, complicated by the giddy environment of filming a teen fantasy. While Weird Science performed decently at the box office, it wasn't a phenomenon like Ghostbusters, 1984, or Back to the Future, 1985. Critics gave it mixed reviews, some praising the comedic mania, others lamenting it felt less substantial than The Breakfast Club. Over time, though, the film found new life on cable, syndicated TV, and videotape rentals, drawing in fans who appreciated its silly premise, 80s fashions, and glimpses of rising talents. The eventual success of the spin-off series in the mid-90s also reintroduced audiences to the original film. That comedic mania anchored in 1980s, teen experimentation with technology belongs to a narrower subgenre. Films like Real Genius, 1985, My Science Project, 1985, and Short Circuit, 1986, likewise explored comedic sci-fi angles. But Weird Science stands out for merging teenage fantasies with an out-and-out magical transformation. Even the Frankenstein references are explicit. Just look at the lightning storm sequence, which mimics the swirl of comedic lightning reminiscent of old Universal horror flicks. Those who look to John Hughes for the evocative teen emotional resonance found in 16 Candles or Pretty in Pink might be initially surprised by Weird Science. The film's entire conceit is cartoonish, yet it still hints at real teen vulnerabilities. Gary and Wyatt are so overshadowed by bullies and their older siblings' scorn that conjuring a Lisa is the only way they can get a sense of social confidence. The comedic arcs revolve around them discovering that you can't just short-circuit personal growth via magic. By the end, they have to face their fears, like stepping up to the bullies, calling out Wyatt's monstrous older brother, and ensuring Lisa is treated as more than a physical object. This moral might appear slight, overshadowed by comedic farce, but it's a testament to Hughes's knack for weaving in a coming-of-age undercurrent. In the film's final sequences, Lisa gracefully bows out once she's taught them the lessons they need. She reverts from living fantasy to ephemeral muse, giving them that last nudge to stand on their own. Despite the comedic mania, there's a heart to weird science typical of a John Hughes project, if not quite as strongly developed as in his other teen classics. Few productions in the mid-'80s hosted such a comedic ensemble of real-life pranksters. In addition to Robert Downey Jr. and Robert Rusler's hijinks, or Anthony Michael Hall's unexpected comedic timing, the entire cast participated in silly behind-the-scenes gags. One story claims that Bill Paxton, at first confounded by playing the military-minded Big Brother, improvised lines about puking on your faces. Another rumor says Kelly LeBrock had to babysit the younger cast members whenever the partying got out of hand. Filming took place in and around Chicago, including sets on the Universal lot and suburban houses that might look suspiciously like those used in other Hughes efforts. According to some interviews, one day John Hughes walked onto set to find Downey Jr. blasting loud music from a boombox while wearing silly costume pieces. Instead of yelling, the director shrugged. If it kept morale high, let the cast blow off steam. This synergy or tension of comedic mania occasionally threatened to sabotage the strict schedule, but the finished product generally conceals the chaos behind the comedic veneer, with only the occasional anecdote about bombs going off or entire sets shaking uncontrollably after an ill-timed fart. Today, a viewer might revisit Weird Science and see it as a time capsule. The hair, the neon fashions, the theme by Oingo Boingo, the archaic technology Memotech MTX 512, and the Playboy-influenced fantasies about building the ultimate dream girl. More sophisticated audiences might find that comedic premise dated, or question the film's approach to female characters. Yet the movie still exudes that intangible 80s comedic magic, an unapologetic sense of fun, with a sweet undertone that ensures no real harm is done. For older fans who watched it on VHS during their youth, Weird Science is an anchor to a moment in pop culture when teen comedies blurred boundaries of logic in favor of laughs. For younger fans who discover it via streaming, the film might strike them as both comedic and quaint, ironically calling to mind how it preceded the vast leaps in CGI or more complex comedic storytelling. Add to that the knowledge that some cast members soared to superstardom or overcame major struggles, Downey's addiction issues, Hall's quest to break from typecasting, etc., and you see Weird Science as a pivotal stepping stone. While overshadowed by the more iconic John Hughes classics, Weird Science endures because it merges the comedic energy of the mid-'80s teen flick with a dash of off-the-wall fantasy. The synergy of Kelly LeBrock's star presence, Anthony Michael Hall's comedic mania, Eileen Mitchell-Smith's naive charm, Bill Paxton's unforgettable turn as Chet, and the cameo mischief of Robert Downey Jr. and Robert Rusler collectively shape the film's lasting comedic identity. The behind-the-scenes stories, ranging from rumored pranks involving excrement to Anthony Michael Hall's on-set flatulence that derailed expensive set pieces, reflect a looser, more rebellious comedic climate in the 1980s. Yes, we see glimpses of questionable comedic choices by modern standards, from potential exploitation angles to the borderline PG-13 approach to sexual content. Yet the film's overall tone is irreverent, not mean-spirited, guided by Hughes's comedic instincts to keep the scenario breezy rather than disturbing. The result is a movie that stands as a testament to an era and a certain brand of humor, an unpolished gem that manages to be silly, whimsical, and at times sweetly sincere in encouraging its teen protagonists to accept themselves. In sum, Weird Science might not be the first John Hughes title people evoke, nor is it the most thematically profound, but it's the film that gave us one of Bill Paxton's funniest roles, an early comedic turn from Robert Downey Jr., and even younger Anthony Michael Hall dancing precariously on the edge of comedic meltdown, and a fantasy premise that is both cringe-inducing and endearing. It resonates as a cult classic that invites nostalgic rewatching, especially for those who recall the delirious possibility that maybe, just maybe, a bedroom rig and a little computer code could conjure up your heart's desire. In the end, that comedic dream is precisely what keeps Weird Science so watchable in the pantheon of 1980s teen comedies. It knew how to be weird, it knew how to embrace its own silliness, and it left an impact strong enough to echo well beyond 1985.